Welcome to the Maine Basketball Commission's Video Coaches Clinic for the 2020-2021 basketball season. In today's session, we'll be covering the National Federation of High Schools rules changes, as well as the points of emphasis. We will begin today's session by discussing the rules changes for the 2020-2021 season. Timer's duties. The first rules change will require the timer to sound a warning signal to announce the 15 seconds permitted for replacing a disqualified or injured player, or for a player directed to leave the game, and signal again at the end of that replacement interval. Timers will now sound two signals related to the 15-second interval of time permitted for replacing a player. The first signal is sounded at the start of the interval, after the official gives the signal to the timer to start the replacement period. The second signal is sounded at the end of the replacement interval. This replacement interval can end in one of two ways: when the 15 seconds expires, or when a substitute is beckoned into the game. The intent of the rules change is to avoid gamemanship and to limit the time allowed for replacing a player to a maximum of 15 seconds. Head coaches who do not have a substitute available at the time the second horn sounds are subject to a direct technical foul. The only exception to this procedure is when a player is injured to the extent that a coach or any other bench personnel is beckoned onto the court to attend to the injured player. The player will be directed to leave the game unless a timeout is granted so the team can attempt to rectify the situation prior to the end of the timeout. It should be noted, teams have the option of using the 30-second timeout or the 60-second timeout for this purpose. If at the end of the timeout the player is unable to continue, a substitute will be requested and the 15-second replacement interval will begin. Forfeiture, protest, and interrupted game. In this rules change, a game shall be declared a forfeit when a coach is removed from the premises for unsporting conduct and no authorized school personnel is present to assume the responsibility for the team. In the state of Maine, authorized school personnel is considered an assistant coach, a principal, an assistant principal, an athletic administrator, or any other certified coach available to take over the team. If none of the individuals are available to take over the supervision of the team, the game will be terminated and ended in a forfeit. If the team to which the game is forfeited is ahead, the score at the time of the forfeiture must stand. If the team is not ahead, the score must be recorded as a 2-0 win in its favor. Head coach's rule. This year's rule change clarifies when a coach may receive a warning for unsporting behavior. In last year's rule, the wording incorrectly implied the head coach was entitled to a warning prior to a technical foul being assessed. This editorial revision is more reflective of the spirit and the intent of the rule. It states, the official may warn the head coach unless the offense is judged to be major, in which case a technical foul shall be ruled. So the penalty for a head coach who is in violation of Rule 10.6.1 may include a warning, unless the offense is judged to be major, in which case a technical foul shall be ruled. The new wording clarifies that an official is not required to give a warning prior to issuing an unsporting technical foul. Points of emphasis. Palming and carrying. Across the country, more and more players are being allowed to illegally dribble the basketball. Inconsistent enforcement of palming and carrying rules by officials has led to this decline in proper fundamentals. By rule, the dribble begins by a player in control who bats, pushes, or throws the ball to the floor before the pivot foot is lifted. The dribble ends when the dribbler allows the ball to come to rest in one or both hands. Anything more than a handshake with the palm vertical to the ground is considered palming. Coaches must teach proper dribbling techniques. Officials must adjudicate the rules as written. Watch the player in blue as she dribbles in the front court. As you can see, the ball comes to rest and she dribbles again. This is a carrying violation and should be ruled by officials. Notice in the inset the hand is below the ball. Watch the dribbler in white as he makes a move into the lane. Once again, the ball comes to rest and he's able to maneuver around a defender and get to the lane and score a goal, and a foul is ruled. This play illustrates the importance of getting these plays right. Instead of the white team turning the ball over to the black team for a throw-in, the white team is now scoring a goal and being awarded a free throw. Lack of rules enforcement in this play can have a significant impact on the outcome of a close game. Intentional and flagrant fouls. There is a distinct difference between an intentional foul and a flagrant foul. A foul should be ruled an intentional foul when a player, while playing the ball, causes excessive contact. An intentional foul should also be ruled away from the ball when it's a non-basketball play. These are considered either personal fouls or technical fouls, depending if the balls are alive or dead when committed. A flagrant foul is violent in nature or a non-contact play demonstrating unacceptable or uncivil behavior. The penalty for a flagrant foul is immediate disqualification. Flagrant fouls. A flagrant foul may be a personal foul or a technical foul of a violent or excessive nature. If personal, it involves, but not limited to, violent contact such as striking, kicking, and kneeing. A flagrant technical foul can also be the result of displaying unacceptable conduct, as demonstrated here. It may also involve dead ball contact or be non-contact, but is deemed extreme, persistent, vulgar, or abusive. Fighting is a flagrant act. In this photograph, both the player in orange and the player in white would be disqualified for fighting. It should also be noted that any action that leads to a fight would also be covered under this rule. Even if the player doesn't participate in the fight, if their action leads to the fight, they would also be disqualified. It should be noted that flagrant acts result in disqualifications for the offender. Intentional fouls. An intentional foul is a personal or technical foul not based solely on the severity of the act. It can include, without being limited to, a personal or technical foul that neutralizes an opponent's obvious advantageous position, as demonstrated by the image on the left. Non-basketball contact away from the ball with an opponent who's clearly not involved in the play is an intentional foul. Contact that's not a legitimate attempt to play the ball or the player is also an intentional foul. As this image demonstrates, the contact is in the back of the offensive player. There was no legitimate attempt to play the ball or the player, so therefore it is an intentional foul. Excessive contact with an opponent while the ball is live or until an airborne shooter returns to the floor is an intentional foul. It should be noted that excessive contact with an airborne player will result in an intentional foul even if the opponent is making a legitimate attempt to play the ball or the player. The Rules Committee is concerned with the safety of airborne players who are in a vulnerable position. Contact that takes away the ability of the airborne player to land safely will result in an intentional foul even if the opponent is making a legitimate attempt to play the player or the ball. Next we will discuss National Federation of High Schools' current interpretation on contact above the shoulders. Contact with a stationary elbow may be ruled incidental contact or a common foul. A stationary elbow is defined as an elbow that is not moving faster than the rest of the player's torso. Contact by an elbow in movement, in other words, moving faster than the rest of the player's torso, but is not excessive, should be ruled an intentional foul. Contact from a moving elbow that is excessive is ruled either an intentional foul or a flagrant foul. It would be considered a flagrant foul if the contact was violent or excessive or an intent to injure. End of game contact. Strategic fouling at the end of games is an acceptable coaching strategy. Coaches and officials need to understand the differences between common and intentional fouls. There is concern there is a lack of rules enforcement for intentional fouls. It is also critical for officials to get the first foul, which will help prevent the game from becoming more physical. On this play, white number 2 wants to commit a strategic foul and does so properly. He makes a play for the ball and does not cause excessive contact. This is an acceptable way to foul near the end of the game. White number 23 also wants to commit a strategic foul. Unfortunately, he approaches the ball handler from behind and grabs his waist. This is not a legitimate attempt to play the ball and is an intentional foul. Players should be trained how to foul properly near the end of the game to avoid this situation. If teams can invest time and practice to make this play easy for officials, all parties will be happier with this ruling near the end of the game. However, if players do not foul properly and foul this way, an intentional foul should be ruled. Again, teams should make an effort to train players how to foul properly near the end of games. Guarding. Guarding is the act of legally placing the body in the path of an offensive opponent. To obtain initial legal guarding position, the front of the guard's torso must be facing the opponent. The guard must have both feet touching the playing court inbounds. In this diagram, the defensive player is legally in the path of the offensive opponent, has 2 feet on the floor, and facing the dribbler. This is considered obtaining legal guarding position. It should be noted the defensive player does not need to be perfectly in the path to obtain legal guarding position. This defensive player has obtained legal guarding position by being in the path with 2 feet facing their opponent. The same can be said for this defensive player. The concept of facing just means any aspect of the torso is in the direction of the offensive opponent. In this case, this player has 2 feet on the floor, in the path, and facing the opponent, and has obtained legal guarding position. After the initial legal guarding position is obtained, the guard may move laterally or obliquely to maintain position, provided it is not toward the opponent when contact occurs. That concept is demonstrated on this diagram as the offensive player has changed direction and the defensive player has moved laterally to get back into the path and maintain legal guarding position. After the initial legal guarding position is obtained, the guard may have 1 or both feet on the playing court or be airborne provided he or she has inbound status. In this image, if white number 23 had already obtained legal guarding position and she is moving laterally to maintain her position, it would be considered legal even if she is airborne and not in contact with the floor. Guarding an opponent with the ball, no time and distance is required to attain initial legal guarding position. In this picture, since the offensive player, white 32, is still on the floor, the defensive player may legally slide into this defensive position, and if contact ensues, the shooter will be responsible for the contact. If the opponent with the ball is airborne, the guard must have obtained legal guarding position before the opponent left the floor. In this photo, red number 3 is airborne. If white 25 obtained this position before red 3 became airborne, this position would be considered legal. However, if red number 3 was airborne before white 25 obtained this position, white 25 will be responsible for the contact if it ensues. Block charge. Blocking is illegal personal contact that impedes the progress of an opponent. It can be on ball as demonstrated by white number 20 here as he sticks his leg out and blocks the dribbler. It can also happen off ball in a screening situation as demonstrated on the image on the right. Charging is illegal personal contact caused by pushing or moving into an opponent's torso. A player who is moving with the ball is required to stop or change direction to avoid contact if a defensive player has obtained legal guarding position. On the play on the left, white number 30 has obtained legal guarding position and maintaining that position. When the dribbler, blue 24, extends the left arm into the torso of the defender, this is a charging foul and a player control foul should be assessed. On the image on the right, again the defensive player has legal guarding position and the dribbler, white number 24, charges into the opponent. If the opponent is displaced, a player control foul should be assessed. If the guard has obtained legal guarding position, the player with the ball must get their head and shoulders past the torso of the defensive player. On this image on the left, the dribbler does not have head and shoulders past the torso of the defensive player. If they move into the torso of the defensive player, a charging foul should be assessed. On the image on the right, the dribbler gets his head and shoulders past the torso of the defensive player. In this situation, if contact ensues on the back torso of the dribbler, the defensive player will be responsible for that contact. There must be reasonable space between two defensive players or a defensive player and a boundary line to allow the dribbler to continue in his or her path. If there is less than 3 feet of space, the dribbler has a greater responsibility for the contact. The player with the ball may not push into the torso of the guard to gain an advantage to pass, shoot, or dribble. If the offensive player moves into the torso of the defensive player to create space to perform an offensive movement, this is illegal and a player control foul should be ruled. Special thanks to the Maine Basketball Commission, Mike Burnham of the Maine Principals Association Interscholastic Committee, Jeff Benson, the Maine Commissioner of Officials, Peter Murray of the Maine Association of Basketball Coaches, and the Maine Interpreters and Site Supervisors, who all contributed to the production of this film. Most importantly, we want to thank you for all you do for the student athletes of Maine. Now more than ever, we see the value of high school athletics, and we greatly appreciate all your efforts during these unusual times. If you have any questions or would like to offer feedback, feel free to contact me during the season. It is our sincere goal that we all work together to provide an outstanding environment for our student athletes to compete. Have a safe and healthy season.